lot of noise in the background. We are bringing to you climate hot news from COP22, and we are live from COP22. We will be talking about COP22, but also what is next for Catholics. If I can just begin by a quote from Pope Francis: "The environment is God's gift to everyone, and in our use of it, we have a responsibility towards the poor, towards future generations, and towards humanity as a whole." Pope Francis recently stated, "It is up to us citizens to insist that governments honour their commitments and indeed to advocate for even more ambitious goals." So what's going on here at COP22? They are discussing various aspects of the Paris Agreement, including rules for emission reductions in terms of ambition, in terms of trading, and various things. And Giulia here will be discussing more about what is being discussed in COP22. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, and this is David Turnbull. He is the Campaigns Director for Oil Change International, and he will talk about a letter that has just come out today, but also his recent report.
Great, thank you so much. As mentioned, today 375 plus organizations from around the world came together to deliver a letter demanding that world leaders put an end to fossil fuel development. This letter was signed by hundreds of organizations from dozens of countries, and we had a really exciting, fun, powerful demonstration today at the COP to talk about this need and this demand. The letter was built from a report that we at Oil Change International just recently put out that shows that the current fossil fuel production around the world has enough carbon underneath it to blow past the goals that we have put forward in the Paris Agreement to keep global warming below 2 degrees of warming. We know that when you dig up fossil fuels, you burn them. And so what we're saying is that we need to stop digging up fossil fuels. We need to keep it in the ground if we are actually going to achieve our climate objectives. The report received a lot of attention around the world, and we're working now to make sure that it receives attention here in Marrakesh as well. So far so good, but the negotiations don't actually talk about fossil fuels in a lot of ways. We talk about reducing emissions, but we don't actually talk about the supply side of the negotiations. So we're trying to raise that voice and raise attention to that issue as well here at COP22 in Marrakesh.
So thank you very much. So just to repeat, the name of that report is called The Sky's Limit, and that's produced by Oil Change International. Okay, over to you, Giulia. So Giulia works with CIDSE. Would you like to start by introducing yourself?
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Giulia, and I work at CIDSE, which is the network of government agencies based here in America. And we work on several different topics, and one of those is climate justice. And yeah, just briefly, in a nutshell, what was in the Paris Agreement, we know very well the temperature goal. Stay below 2 degrees, but also to push efforts to stay below 1.5, which is very vital for small island states, especially. We have the so-called INDCs and our NDCs, which are the national pledges. But we also know that those national pledges won't keep us below the temperature goal in the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement also has a human rights and security language, although it's in the preamble and not in the operational part. So, and also, of course, finance, which wasn't so advanced. I mean, this here in Marrakesh, the COP has been framed as the COP of action. But now, starting on the second week, we saw in the first week that actually the urgency factor is more the center. And we need countries to be more ambitious and to show really like their commitment to reach the temperature goal, because we know very well that to stay below 1.5 we have very limited carbon budget to use. And this is so the urgency aspect needs to be taken up. Maybe briefly, I can say in the details, as CIDSE, we're also a bit disappointed of how the agriculture negotiations has been going on during the first week, because we saw a block between the EU and the G7, and so yeah, the talks has been postponed for next year. So again, it seems like the country are not taking this seriously. So it's really important that the high-level segment that is going to start tomorrow. So I have to stay here in Marrakesh. I hope and we hope that there will be a better political push. I just want to also quickly to mention about the citizens' engagement and mobilization, which is very, very important. We know very well that the road to Paris, there's been a lot of demonstration, organization, or to the coordination and pilgrimage. So we see actually a lot of action taken on the street, and so I really hope that the countries are looking at what citizens are doing, and also to really address the climate change issue, we need to tackle the aspects of consumption and production. And we as CIDSE, we are promoting a campaign for Change for the Planet before and promote sustainable lifestyles. Yeah, so be happy to take more questions afterwards.
Thank you very much. That was a very good summary. Thank you. So now over to my boss, Fletcher Harper. He is the Executive Director of GreenFaith, and he's going to be talking about the Faith Call to Action.
Thanks, Ciara, and thanks for the chance to be here. The big news from GreenFaith, the interfaith environmental organization that I serve, is that there's been the release of this very hard-hitting, powerful call to action by over 250 faith leaders from around the world, from over 40 countries, who've come together around 5 or 6 key points that they are calling on world leaders to sit up and take notice on. And just briefly, it's first of all really consequential that this large number of leaders from this diverse range of traditions has come together. The director of CIDSE signed on CIDSE's behalf, the Global Catholic Climate Movement, the Dalai Lama, Desmond Tutu, the president of the World Council of Churches, the chancellor of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences and Social Sciences, high-level Muslim, the director of the Islamic Society of North America, high-level Muslim and Buddhist and Hindu leaders. These are leaders that represent, whose traditions represent over 75% of the world's population. And so this scope of response demands our attention. And what they're calling for is increased commitments and ambition from governments in line with the 1.5 degree temperature threshold that we've all been talking about. They're calling for governments and their sovereign wealth funds and state-sponsored pension funds to shift money out of the kind of fossil fuel infrastructure investments that David described that we can't have any more of into clean energy projects. They're calling for this transition to be managed in a way that respects human rights, gender equality, that respects environmental integrity. No big hydroelectric projects dressed up as appropriate responses, because those projects displace tens of thousands of people, violate their human rights, violate environmental values that we need to protect. And the statement also calls on religious institutions to up their game in terms of more divestment commitments, investments by religious, civil society, government sectors into ending energy poverty with clean energy. It's a very, very strong statement, and while lots of countries are still sort of moving towards getting their Paris commitments fulfilled, it recognizes that we don't have any time to waste, and the time for more ambition is absolutely now, and that the kind of delay that Giulia mentioned is really one that we can't have.
Fantastic. So we will go on to talk about the Muslim divestment in the question section. Okay, so now I'm delighted. You all know Tomás, who is the Executive Director of GCCM. Take it away, Tomás.
So, well, thank you, Ciara. Thanks for this wonderful to be joining these great speakers today. And now we also wanted to use this webinar to inform our network. We have lots of viewers joining in today from all continents, member organizations, GCCM, Laudato Si animators, etc. We wanted to use this webinar also to be an opportunity to brief everyone on what's coming up, what's next for Catholics. So I would like to mention a few things we'll be sharing for everybody who signed up for the webinar. We'll be sharing clear, what are the dates, but I wanted to share a bit in advance what are those things coming on. So in the first place, Advent is coming in. It's coming up very soon in 2 weeks. So we'll use the Advent time to work on the issue, the theme of consumerism. So we'll be working, it's just a perfect time to work on the issue of consumerism. We know that we need to deeply transform our lifestyles, and what better than the Advent time and Christmas to rethink our lifestyles and the way we consume. So that's coming up. Next, in early next year, something really exciting. I'm glad that Fletcher talked about fossil fuel divestment. So you might have heard that we had a few announcements this past months, about Catholic institutions making the stance, making the decision to divest from fossil fuels. Our next joint announcement is on March 1st. So that's Ash Wednesday, the first day of Lent. We'll have many more Catholic institutions coming up and making public their decision to divest from fossil fuels. We'll have a conference before that in Rome. For those of you who are in Rome, we'll have a conference in January 27th on the issue of divestment, fossil fuel divestment, which will be very exciting. So we encourage you, those of you who are working in institutions that could divest, dioceses or religious orders or any other kind of Catholic institution that could divest, to keep in mind that the next big date is Ash Wednesday, March 1st. Then something that we're hoping to make really big is what we call Mercy to Earth Sunday. So this is April 22nd and 23rd. It happens, it's a very interesting weekend. So April 22nd, it's Earth Day. And the day after that, Sunday the 23rd, we have Mercy Sunday. It's which we celebrate in the Catholic tradition. And you might know that Pope Francis recently published his follow-up of Laudato Si, as Cardinal Turkson coined it, which was his message for September 1st, called Show Mercy to Our Common Home. So we'll use that weekend, Earth Day and Mercy Sunday, to dive into the Pope's message and showing mercy to our common home. And all of you, we're encouraging the whole GCCM network to use that weekend to be a big moment to mobilize your local community, to raise awareness about Laudato Si, to raise awareness about the Pope's Show Mercy to Our Common Home message, and most importantly, taking concrete action in your community. And related to that, you'll hear more. We're joining, especially in the US, there will be a big climate march on April 29th. So the following weekend, there will be, especially now with the news of the Trump administration, it will be especially important that we join the wider climate movement in making a strong call to action in the streets, calling for bold climate policies. So I'll stop there. Of course, then we'll have the anniversary of Laudato Si in June, and we'll have the season of creation in September. But as of now, short term, mid term, that's what's coming up.
Great, thank you very much. What an exciting. Hang on 1 second. Okay, so what an exciting year ahead, Tomás, and thank you so much for all you do for GCCM. So we're now going to transition into the questions. I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm going to keep going anyway. So I just wanted to start off with a few points. So one is, a lot of people are obviously concerned about Trump and the US position within the Paris Agreement and within the UNFCCC Convention. So just to clarify that the US cannot withdraw for 3 years. They're locked in for 3 years, and then they have to give 1 year's notice. So the US are here for 4 years, and that is in the Paris Agreement, or around the Paris Agreement. In terms of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, actually Trump can reverse that in 1 year. So that is really, really quite serious. And you just got to think of all of the potential collateral social and political damage and economic damage that that would cause. So that's a backdrop to the US. So I'd now like to ask you a particular question, David, around your report. So when I had a quick look at your report, you did talk about that in fact 100% of all fossil fuels need to stay in the ground. We're ready to, we're going to be blowing over. There's obviously the carbon tracker report that was written, I think, 3 or 4 years ago. You mentioned 60 to 80%, but you're saying actually everything needs to stay in the ground. But that's not my point. My point, which you then went on to say, is that we need to have a just and a managed transition. We've got to think about those communities who work in the fossil fuel industry, and we need to think about the communities who also work with the workers. So I noticed that was one of your key points. So I think also I'd like to hit the main perspective. Managing that just transition is a climate justice point as well. So David, if you can start with that.
Thank you. And yet, just to clarify, our report says that we can't have any new fossil fuel development. What is already under development may be able to be dug up. There may be some projects that need to be stopped before they're fully developed. But your point about the managed decline and just transition is critical, and it's absolutely fundamental to the demands that we're putting forward. We can't embark on a transition that isn't just. It's simply repeating problems of the past. This economy is not just in the way that it's extracting fossil fuels. We see a few different pathways that the world can go down. The first pathway is a managed decline and a just transition. It's the most logical pathway if you look at the climate science, if you look at what is a truly just pathway forward. The second option is we don't do anything and we end up with climate chaos and unthinkable results. A third option is that we don't actually manage the decline. We don't start now, but we do take action later. And if we take action later, it's going to have to be more drastic. It's going to be harder to actually protect workers and communities from the impacts of really shifting our economy. And so it will have equally devastating impacts on our economy and on jobs and on our communities. And so when we look at the need to move away from fossil fuels, we're working to engage with labor unions and other communities to ensure that communities aren't left behind, that we bring them along and that they are lifted up so that they have jobs in the new clean energy economy.
Okay, thank you. I mean, another question would be, but I do want to turn to Fletcher, but I'm just going to raise this point. Who has done any mapping on understanding which of those most vulnerable communities, where are those fossil fuel towns, villages, etc.? So I don't think within the Paris Agreement that the just transition is properly articulated, and I think certainly that's something we in the faith community can do. Fletcher, tell me more about what you think the just transition is.
Well, in very concrete terms, what it means is it means things like for people who are put out of work because of the transition, it means income continuation for a certain period of time. It means that the government has funds that are used to continue to pay people their salaries for a period of time so that they make the transition. It means a substantial increase in consistent commitment to retraining programs of various kinds. Because what we see is there is growth in the clean energy sector. And while not 100% of those jobs transmit over, an awful lot can and do. And that kind of investment from the government side needs to be made. And we need to do that as part of a net positive. I mean, study after study after study has shown that per dollar invested in the fossil fuel sector versus the clean energy, renewable energy sector, a dollar in that clean sector produces more job creation than it does in the fossil fuel sector. So this shouldn't be viewed as a sort of as a horror. It should be viewed as the transition that's got to be made and that can create more work. We need to talk about certain communities, like you said, that are in the oil patch regions of the countries that are affected, and those communities are going to get hurt. There needs to be community investment. And again, we need to see this as a net positive. If these communities are really, put into economic distress, the government's going to end up providing aid in various ways to those communities regardless. If you get out in front of it, like David said, and manage it, the money goes in, it does good, and it helps the transition happen better and faster. So these are the kinds of investments that have to get made.
Brilliant answer. Fletcher, do you mind just quick mentioning to the audience of GCCM about the Muslim diversity.
At the side event last week where the interfaith statement was released, there was a striking announcement from the Islamic Society of North America. They announced that they are committing to divest from fossil fuels. And it's a statement and a decision that takes a lot of courage, because the significant portion of the charitable work within the Muslim community globally is funded by petrodollars. And this is a sort of a, not at all a well-kept secret. And so for a very prominent Muslim institution to make that statement publicly and to justify it on very well-articulated Islamic ethical grounds takes a lot of courage, and I think is a real sort of sign that more and more leaders within that community recognize the time has come to make this shift.
And this was the first public Muslim divestment so far. So Tomás, I would like to sort of go back to Pope Francis. So he recently said that citizens must insist that governments honour their commitments and advocate for an increase in ambition. Can you articulate a bit on how you see GCCM helping in terms of pushing for greater ambition?
Totally. So, great question. And yes, indeed, that's one of the key calls of Pope Francis, both in Laudato Si and in his recent message for September 1st, is asking citizens and asking the faithful of the Catholic Church to go out to the streets. And actually, something interesting to note is that Laudato Si praises the ecological movement and praises all the work and pressure that has been already building up over governments to take bold action. So at GCCM, we're trying to help the Catholic community do this. We did this last year, for example, helping facilitating the mobilization of people. You might remember from the big global climate march, about 40,000 of us from our network went out to the streets. That was wonderful. And we should see way more engagement, especially after the recent news about the new administration in the US. We'll really need, not only in the US, but abroad, and everywhere, we really need to increase the pressure we're putting on governments. So, as I mentioned briefly before, a very clear opportunity is this upcoming climate march on April 29th. So please save the date. April 29th is this major climate march that is coming up. The epicenter, I believe, will be in Washington, D.C. But given now the international repercussions of the Trump news election, there will be very likely marches happening in other capitals around the globe, asking to the U.S. government and others to take action. So yeah, that's coming up.
Okay, great. And I guess another way would be, Tomás, is that any Catholic is very, very welcome to be sending letters off to their local politicians or their environment secretaries and pushing for that increase in ambition. Giulia, so at the end of your presentation, you mentioned a CIDSE campaign. If you could just talk a little bit about your latest campaign.
Sure. So we launched the campaign last year, and the campaign is focusing on promoting sustainable lifestyles, and especially with regards to the production and consumption, but also we'll be looking at energy issues, of course, a very important one. And we are, of course, inspired by the Laudato Si messages, but also we acknowledge the need to bring about a systemic change. As I was saying before, we don't have time. I mean, we really need to act now. Otherwise, small island states will just disappear. The refugee crisis that we're seeing now will increase. So it's really important that all actors at this level take action and get engaged in addressing climate aspects. And we know very well that climate change impacts a lot of the food. So with the campaign, we try to promote actually stories of change that are happening on the ground, because we see through the partners that CIDSE support in different countries, many communities have solutions. Actually, it's possible to create another world through their solutions. So what we're trying to do is really to showcase the stories of change. Also, another important thing I would like to mention is we will be launching next year a photo competition. So a photo competition where people can portray these type of solutions, and we will show the winning pictures, winning photos at the European Parliament. So we will also show the politicians what citizens are doing on the ground. But can I just make one quick point on especially the negotiations here, because it's really important that pre-2020 actions are being taken, and we need to see all the different sectors getting engaged. So as I was saying before, the agriculture, the energy, because if we have stronger pre-2020 commitments, then we can push for higher ambition for post-2020. So that's also one of the messages that we developed in the CSO review that was published last week, which the CSO signed on. So it's really, really important.
Okay, thank you, Giulia. So just to sort of re-emphasize Giulia's first point is that there is not a sense of urgency that is needed here at COP22 within turning Paris Agreement into action. And that's certainly something where Catholics and all the other faith communities have been pushing for. So now I have some questions. We have one from Monica in Canada. And she says, given recent events, can you describe, sorry.
Sure. So the question from Monica in Canada is, given recent events, can you describe the tone and feeling here, and do you feel like there is a shadow of uncertainty cast in the talks, in the Marrakesh talks, because of the upcoming change in the US? How is that affecting things at COP22? And it's an open-ended question, so I'm not sure if David or...
Does anyone take?
I think there's two ways to answer this question. One is sort of on a human level. Many of us are still processing what's taken place. I think that it's interesting to be here at the negotiations after such a major development back home. We're still processing that. But that said, there are hopeful things that I want to highlight. Today's event that we held was 375 organizations standing together from around the world. It was beautiful, it was powerful. We talked about different struggles to resist fossil fuel development in Brazil and in Nigeria, in Canada, the tar sands, and all across the world. No country is talking about following Donald Trump out of the Paris Agreement. No one is saying that we're going to abandon this process. Everyone is saying we're going full speed ahead, except for Donald Trump. And so to me, that's been a really hopeful thing, to see the determination of countries around the world, delegates, CSOs, civil society. People here are determined to continue the momentum that we've had in this process that was achieved in Paris and that continues beyond it. And the other thing is that businesses are moving forward anyways, and there's no stopping that. So it's going to be challenging. There's going to be challenges in the years ahead. There's no doubt about that. It's a huge disappointment, but this is where we are.
I think from a faith perspective also, we need to underscore that the results of this election and the Brexit decision and what we see across Northern Europe is a signal, I think, that we need to make the case much more clearly and much more plainly about the economic benefits of a transition to a renewable energy economy, and we need to make that real and evident for people and make it clear that that transition will result in some economic redistribution of wealth, because that's something that is behind some of the political tension we're seeing. I think we also need to recognize that before the Paris Agreement, there was real concern about the capacity of governments to deliver, and a recognition of the importance of the financial sector and civil society as key players in this. And I think that's another thing. That's why the divestment and investment calls, the newly emerging One for All campaign, which is calling for mission-based institutions to commit to invest to end energy poverty with clean energy by 2030. Initiatives like that and the capacity of faith institutions to help shape the culture. We've got our work cut out for us, and we have to really recommit to that.
Thank you very much, Fletcher. So, Fletcher, at the end, you did mention One for All. If you want to read some more information on that, you can find it on greenfaith.org or interfaithstatement2016.org. And this is an initiative under Sustainable Energy for All, under Rachel Kite, and it is inviting faith foundations and philanthropists to explore ways of working together, but to really look in the investment side. So, Tomás, this is a question for you. How do Catholics impress on the Trump administration that we do not agree with his proposed climate policy?
Good question. So I mean, it's up to us actually to deliver the message to the Trump administration that we really are calling for bold climate action, for bold action for climate justice. So I mean, it's still to be seen. I mean, everything is so new. I think we're all trying to understand what is going on and what is going to happen in the coming months. So I would encourage everybody, all the viewers today joining us, that, and especially those in the US, that we really step up the level of action and our activism and our engagement with governments. And here I think especially important is engaging Congress. But I think it will be tough to engage the White House, but I think there's more opportunity to engage as well Congress and congressmen, and especially there are lots of Catholics in Congress, and lots of them are Republicans. So, and both Democrats as well. So in the case of the US, I think there will be a lot of work ahead. So I would encourage everybody to start planning, start organizing, start reaching out, start working also with other faiths, with the wider climate movement in your local district, to really start getting this message that we will struggle hard for this climate global action to happen. So yeah, it will be challenging. It will be definitely very challenging.
We can do it.
And perhaps as a non-Catholic, I would say get more involved in GCCM. I mean, it is really vitally important that Catholics rally around. The Catholic Church has a massive footprint. It can make a decisive difference, and GCCM is the sort of leading edge of making that response real. So, get more on board.
Thank you for that trumpet call, Fletcher. Just a couple of things. I think we do have quite a lot of listeners from Brazil, so if speakers can slow down a bit. Giulia, a question to you. So this is coming from Brazil. It says, we want to sensitize more Catholics to care for the environment. Brazil's greatest contribution to the increase in greenhouse gas emissions is the burning of its forests, while the majority of people actually live in cities. How can we sensitize people living in cities to raise awareness of their environmental responsibility beyond urban spaces?
All right, that's a very interesting question, and I think it's very relevant indeed, because action needs to be taken in the urban areas. And we actually recently had a workshop on climate and agriculture, and we had testimonies from Brazil. And it was very inspiring to hear that, especially in the city of Rio de Janeiro, and we know very well how big and complex the city is. There are groups who are promoting sustainable agriculture practices, so agroecological practice in the cities, engaging also with youth, engaging with the women, with the most excluded from society. So I think there are many ways in which all the different groups living in the urban areas can get together and can really create the change and can really lead the change by example.
Okay, Does anyone else want to answer that question? I have a comment around that question, but any of the speakers would like to also take on that question.
Well, I think that one of the things that's critical is for there to be more engagement between civil society groups and indigenous communities in Brazil who are very much on the front lines of those issues and who are feeling the worst effects of the deforestation and for whom it's a sort of existential and cultural annihilation issue on many levels. And there's been good work that the Catholic Church in Brazil has done over the last decades, building bridges with those indigenous communities, and that needs to happen. I mean, Sister Dorothy Strang is one example of someone who was essentially martyred for her work connecting with indigenous communities and seeking to protect the forests. I think that needs to, those bonds need to be strengthened and increased, because it's by an increase in awareness that more and more Catholics and more the rest of us will realize the importance of protecting those forests.
Okay, so I wanted to bring in Indonesia, which, as you know, is majority Muslim. So there has been a fatwa on deforestation in Indonesia. So all of the Islamic scholars got together. In particular, they spoke about the smog that the deforestation is causing, and then they hooked that up to the health impacts. But picking up on what Reverend Fletcher Harper has just said, perhaps there could be some sort of high-level religious leader, Catholics with the indigenous leaders, really speaking about deforestation in Brazil and the different impacts. So that would be that point. So that has taken us to the end of our session. So I want to thank all of these amazing speakers and their very, very insightful presentations. Very grateful to them, and to you for bearing with us in terms of starting late. Thank you for your great questions. And I will just pass over to Tomás to close.
So thanks, Ciara, thanks, Fletcher, David, and Giulia for joining us today. It's been an honor to co-host this webinar, both GCCM and CIDSE. So yeah, just as closing words, would like to remind everybody, I think one of the themes that was heard here a lot was urgency. We really need to stress the urgency of the climate crisis. And actually, I would encourage everybody to start talking about climate crisis instead of climate change. We need really to start conveying seriously the urgency of this crisis. So, I mean, for example, the groundbreaking report by All Change International 2 months ago is pretty dramatic. I mean, we really need to shut down the fossil fuel industry pretty soon. I mean, it sounds really hard to say it that way, but we need to shut down that industry. So, and of course, being very mindful of the communities that work in that industry, but we need to do it, and we need to do it very quickly. So, and let's keep in mind that, as Pope Francis likes to frame this crisis, that it's a social crisis as well. So it's not only just taking action because we need to care for the environment, which is of course a very important thing, but we need to take action on behalf of our sisters and brothers in poverty, those who are in the front lines of this crisis, those who are going to suffer the worst impacts of this crisis. So that said, thanks for joining us. We'll be sending a follow-up email to everybody who joined. We'll be sending also this list, the save the dates for all this upcoming action. I know that many Catholic institutions need to plan way ahead, or Catholic parishes, for all the activities that are coming up. It will be a busy year. 2017 will be very, very, very busy, and we need to make sure we're mobilizing our own communities as well, and with the level of urgency that we need. So thanks for joining us. Stay tuned for the follow-up email and follow-up action. And yeah, have a wonderful day or afternoon or evening, depending where you are. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.